Welcome everybody to second Huddle for Foodies. This is a climate special. We're bringing together some entrepreneurs who are running small businesses working to make food better. And in this huddle, we're going to talk about climate and the way that we both need to be part of a climate solution and also be adapting to climate change. These are big things that are going to affect all food businesses around the world. It's really clear that food is a massive part of the problem and a part of the solution. Our food system produces about, depending on your numbers, somewhere between 20 and 30% of all greenhouse gases. So it's unimaginable to think that we could turn around climate change without bringing in the food system. But the food system is doubly important because not only is it producing greenhouse gases at the moment, it can become a solution. It can become a carbon sink. You know, there's every reason to think that we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere where we don't need it and put it into our soil and our biomass. And if we change the way we produce food, we can do it in a way that's regenerative and restores our natural capital with benefits to biodiversity, benefits to resilience as good soils also hold more water and more nutrients, better food come from those nutrients. There's all sorts of kind of multiple wins if we get this right. But it's really hard to change the food system, and SMEs have a role to play. Let's just start with some quick introductions of who's here today. I'm Ian, I'm running the Good Food Hub, but Claire and Shubham, perhaps you could just give us a quick 1-minute introduction of you and your business.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Glad to be here. I'm Shubham Chandra. I own a few companies. We do consulting work in the ag tech space. We have 25 patents in an ag tech space for a product that extends the shelf life of fresh fruits and vegetables. And my work has primarily been doing a lot of shelf life studies across Asia, Africa, and North America. And some of my products have been licensed to some Fortune 500 companies and are on the shelf right now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Claire?
Yeah, I'm Claire Baker, calling in from Bozeman, Montana. My company is called the Toothpick Project. We're a biological herbicide. Our headquarters is in Kakamega, Kenya, actually, and we're one of the first commercialized bioherbicides in the world. And we're called the Toothpick Company because we use a fungus as our agent for killing a specific weed called striga, and then we grow that fungus onto toothpicks, and that's how we deliver it to the village level. And then here in the US, I'm also a partner at a small high-protein oat company here in Montana.
Oh, great. Okay.
So,
well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
You're part of the plant-based diet future. We between you, I think we cover all our bases. Then we basically, I was just looking at Project Drawdown, and so the sort of the big ways of that Project Drawdown are basically look at climate solutions and they measure the importance of them. And against the kind of the food area, they come up with three big areas. One is addressing waste and diets. So in terms of shifting diets, the big one is to shift to plant-based diets. So your oat company, I'm sure, is part of that. Addressing waste, Shubham, all the kind of, the more we can address food waste, that is a huge piece of the puzzle. And I know that's part of your work. And then protecting ecosystems is a big one. So if we can get better use out of the existing land that we're using, so we're avoiding converting new land is really important, but also, so that's about actually protecting what we've got so we're not encroaching on new areas. And the last one is shifting agricultural practices, doing things in ways that are regenerative. And I know your toothpicks are part of that story. But Claire, you raised a couple of good questions. Do you want to share what they are, about things that you're asking as you figure out your company's role in this, in the climate crisis?
Sure. So I don't know that much about this. This is why I asked the questions, but I do know that it's a growing field of carbon credits for sequestering carbon in the soil. So these are credits that farmers can earn through their agricultural practices. And now that's becoming more of a thing. And now that's also expanding to ecosystem markets. And so I just don't know that much about it. I've looked at some of the different companies that are doing this, and a lot of them seem to be for large scale farmers, which is great because I'm in Montana where we have, 1 million acres of wheat. So farmers, my colleagues in ag here could make a pretty good amount of money. I've seen they could make, $12,000 or something off of 1,000 farms. But what I haven't seen is how this can work for small scale farmers if they only have an acre of land. Is there even a mechanism? And if they're making $12 an acre for their carbon sequestration, I don't know how that works. So that was one of my questions. And then my other question was about impact and how to measure the impact. And it's one thing to measure your impact if you've removed something that's a problem, and you can measure, food waste. You can measure what has been saved. For us with our herbicide, how do I measure that when we're not replacing something, we're introducing something new? So, which is potentially replacing something.
Yeah. Well, why don't we all just dip into your first question? Because I too went on some of that journey doing some research last year, trying to understand the role of soil carbon and what we can do. And, it was really clear, it was absolutely compelling that we basically need to change the incentives for farmers so that they are getting paid to restore natural capital and protect it. But as soon as you lift the lid on the how, it gets really messy and complicated. But there are people that are beginning to do it. So, there's some good examples that I came across. One is a company called Nori, NORI.com. They're currently, I think, mostly US based, but they have a mechanism by which they are helping farmers sell their carbon it's a bit like if I went to offset my own businesses, I can buy carbon off them and pay them. So they're creating a marketplace for me to be able to buy off farmers, but they're also providing the tools for those farmers to verify that efficiently. And it looks like they're getting some good traction and beginning to have that kind of marketplace. So I can almost pick a farm that I want to buy my credits off. So that they seem like, they'd really thought it through. Otherwise, you get into these bigger things like Vera, they seem like the really biggest voluntary carbon credit kind of trading scheme. My sense of that is at the moment it's really complicated, but people are beginning to do the work to ask how to simplify it for smaller scale, because just the level of bureaucracy makes it impenetrable. The transaction costs are just too high for anybody that doesn't have a massive scheme going on. And I think there's a few of those, but the kind of Vera and this Gold Standard, they're the really big ones. But the players like Nori are coming in and trying to make it more accessible. There was a really interesting small Australian company that I can't remember the name of now, but I'll try and find it. They figured out a way of using satellite data. So looking at satellites, and satellite data is now good enough that from the photo, they can get a proxy by looking at like annual ground cover, for example. They can get a solid proxy for how much carbon you're sequestering into the soil year on year. And so they're beginning to see if they can do it just by using satellite data. And if that's good enough, then it becomes much more affordable. You're not having to do kind of field testing and the like. So they were trying to basically dramatically reduce the costs because these things, what you're talking about is really tied together, because the MRV piece, the cost of measurement, reporting and verification is what makes this, the access and the carbon credits really hard for smaller scale producers, because it's just too much work. But if we can get affordable MRV, then suddenly those markets might emerge. And that's, people are playing around the edges on it.
There's some funds for where instead of getting cash, you get trees. And one of my Game Changer Lab cohorts has talked quite a bit about, like, Timberland, the shoe company, has a tree credit program.
Okay.
But I haven't, it'll be interesting to see how quickly this grows and develops, because I think there's a big push for it right now.
Does make me wonder, there's another concept, is carbon insetting. Have you heard of carbon insetting? So carbon insetting is, companies like Nestle are doing it, where they realize that climate change is a risk to their supply chain. So unless they're coffee or cocoa growers are actually restoring natural capital, they're not degrading the natural capital on which the crop depends, and also are not prepared for tougher climates, that's a risk to their supply chain. So rather than paying for offsets kind of externally to get themselves to net zero, they are using that money by doing insetting, where they're paying their farmers to, in this case, it's to plant tree crops over their coffee bushes. And so they're paying for that, which is then regenerative. So they're getting, because got tree crops, you've got a more, I forget what it's called, but kind of multi-tiered agroforestry system. That means also those farmers have got more diverse incomes. There's multiple benefits to it. So it's interesting. I wonder whether there might be ways that whether you could work within a supply chain that meant some of your people that you're working with were benefiting from a carbon insetting scheme, if they're part of more larger, supply chains that have got some of those larger actors that might be looking for that. That could be a different avenue to explore.
Yeah, that could be, as we're growing. A lot of the farmers we work with are already working within some other farmer group, whether it's just a little community farm group or an organization like Built Hunger Hill for a 1 acre fund or something like that. So
Claire, when you talk about these farmers, are these farmers in Africa or are these farmers here in North America?
I'm thinking more specifically about the farmers in Africa.
Okay.
How can they benefit from this? They're already getting the rough end of the stick as far as climate impact. They're feeling that they're on the front line of it. So so just trying to figure out how can they make extra income by doing the right thing on their farms, which of course they're trying to do. In the US, I don't see that farmers have a benefit to transitioning to better practices. We're just pretty chemical heavy, monocropping,
And that's the thing that in the US, for that to happen, a lot of these companies, I don't want to put names there, but who are selling these chemicals need to step up and look at sustainable options beyond what they're doing right now, because the onus shouldn't be on the farmers to do it, because if the farmers are getting that, that's what they'll do. You can't tell the farmers, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, when they have been provided those inputs at a very economical rate. And on the flip side, when you talk about Africa, that's one of the issues that we have, is that we have so many players in the supply chain. I was talking to a person in Nigeria. He said there are 99 layers between farm to customer. And a lot of these players control the market. So it's tough to introduce these carbon footprint, carbon negative initiatives when you have these major players controlling the supply chain. And the challenge always is, how do you handle that? How do you work with those intricacies and challenges that you have in the supply chain for countries such as Nigeria or Kenya, for that matter? Because those kind of intermediaries that you have, you don't hear them about in North America or EU, because it's a more formalized system. You have a farmer, you have a distribution network, you have a retailer, you have a buyer, you have a customer. Now, there could be more sublets to it, but not like that. And it's always a challenge trying to figure out this input of the environmental impact and the challenge of working with these players. And I haven't had the faintest clue of how to get around it. I mean, since you in Kenya, have you seen that? I mean, what is your input from based on that? Because I'm expecting it should be the same for, if it's for Nigeria, Kenya is a similar market.
Yeah, most of the farmers that we work with are just subsisting on what they grow. They're not actually even to a point where they're growing for a market that's then feeding into more markets. The supply chain is actually quite short. It's from their farm to their table. And so I think, part of that is because we're working with Striga farmers who have Striga, who are really at the low end of the success rate. So we're just trying to get them over that immediate barrier that they have to producing enough yield that they could actually have surplus and then sell it on the market. So yeah, I don't see 99 layers, but it is, it doesn't mean that they're still not impacting global food supply as an individual, because they're part of the receiving end as well, and they're purchasing food. So
are you in part, I'm just wondering the extent to which it sounds like you've got quite a direct relationship with the farmers because of the nature of who they are. But I'm curious, in Kenya, there is a transition to a more structured supply chains. I think of Twiga Foods. I don't know if you come across them, but they've been really game changing in terms of kind of building this bridge, starting with bananas, and they've built out to lots of other crops now, of getting a much more ability to sort of source from small scale farmers and bring it into urban markets and being really efficient in that journey. And that is a classic story of the way actually small businesses are really crucial for putting in the kind of structure and efficiency that might start making farmers more profitable, basically, and more supply chains more efficient as those players come in as pioneers until those supply chains get more structured and consolidated. And Twiga Foods kind of embody that. And I wonder whether they're the sort of partner that you could work with. The biggest, one of the biggest credit schemes in the world for voluntary carbon for soil carbon is in the Northern Rangelands. It's a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, where they've been working with some of the big conservancies up in the north to sell carbon credits and verify them, because they can operate on a scale. It's all I think about changing the way that livestock grazing is happening on those lands to make it more regenerative. But I wonder whether if you had the right partners, whether there's scope for coming up with a scheme that was well designed, that meant suddenly you're operating at a scale that you can start selling, the kind of progress and the outcomes you're getting onto, whether it's ecosystem services or whether it's carbon credits, whether that becomes more realistic because you're working with slightly bigger partners and more structured supply chains. But maybe your particular niche is so specific that would be hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, it would be basically like pooling the market somehow. Yeah, and some of these larger players like Twiga, they're working with thousands of, I don't know how many farmers they work with, but they've been growing quickly. So then they can have that carbon question and management to be an added benefit for farmers to grow with them. Yeah, that would be good. I mean, we're just in startup mode. It took us 12 years of research and development, and we just got approval to be commercial in March. So we're just now collecting farmers. We're serviced about 2,000 farmers this year. This last growing season that we're in right now, actually. So we're not in a position to manage or organize a carbon market, but it could be part of our program somehow.
Mm-hmm. If you need an introduction to the guy, one of the founder of Twiga, I have briefly met him, and I do have his email, so I could at least connect the two if there has ever felt like it might be valuable, because given where you're operating, there'd be I think a fun and interesting partner. If I don't know whether you'd find the mutual interest, but I'd be certainly happy to make the connection.
Thanks.
Shubham, just to kind of keep the conversation rolling, you were just asking, I don't know whether your business, whether specific things that you're thinking about in terms of climate change. Is there anything you'd like to kind of bring into the conversation? And you were mentioning food waste, but maybe that was more as a kind of theoretical thing rather than something directly about your business. But any questions you've got?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not theoretical, because that's what we do. I mean, and okay. I think food waste, there are two things to it. Food waste is more of a loss happening at the end of the supply chain. Food loss is what most countries in Africa and Southeast Asia talk about, because that happens in the front end of the supply chain. And both have an impact on the environment. The technologies that we use are relevant to both of them: food waste and food loss. It's better that technology insertion happens at the front end of the supply chain, which is where the farm gate level and the farmers and the farmer associations level, because that's where the maximum amount of losses are happening in Southeast Asia and Africa. I mean, talking about 40% of the food is lost. Now, that's where technology insertion happened. And the challenge is obviously going to be that the lack of cold chain. I mean, there are no cold chain available. I mean, there have been efforts to include these technologies such as the zero energy chambers. Now that could be a good fit for a carbon footprint, because what you're looking at using just zero energy chambers or using solar panels to provide some sort of an offset for your produce at the farm gate level that helps you reduce the losses. It does have an impact on the produce and helps the produce at the farm gate level. So, I mean, there are technologies out there that have been leveraged to help the farming community, but those are very far in between, especially for farmers who can't afford, or there needs to be concerted effort more from the governments or the organizations that are working in this field to promote these, because it's not, the onus cannot be on the farming community to move this forward, because they don't have the money, they don't have the funds. And
do you have other ways in which you can get, for a solution like that, are you ever seeing people approach you because they're willing to kind of pay for carbon credits? Because, if you are reducing food loss at that early stage, that is clearly going to have, that's carbon positive. I wonder whether there's a way you could actually help fund some of that work and generate an extra revenue stream to support
we are actually working on that, because we have identified 2 farms in Nigeria. And what we're doing is that these farms are actually collecting the produce from these farmers. And the idea is that we are developing a marketplace for these farmers to access, and that marketplace would allow the consumers to buy directly from them. There is a huge requirement for good produce around Lagos and Kigali area, where the people have the ability to pay, and they're looking for ways of more of a supply chain that is more visible. And so we are connecting the dots, and we're connecting the farmers directly to the consumer to a marketplace. And that's what one of the things that we're working on. And the challenge obviously is that there are too many transportation losses for the produce from the farm to the farm gate to the distributors, and then the losses are happening at the retail to the consumer. So we're looking at inserting these technologies in these areas where you can reduce the food loss. This is not food waste, but food loss that we're talking about. We're actually talking to some farms here in the US side where we are embedding the technology in the punnets that they use to figure out if we can reduce the food waste. That's more at the consumer level. So the consumer can get strawberries or berries that he has, and he or she can eat it before it goes bad, because the shelf life of these strawberries, even in a refrigerator, is too short.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are ways of we're looking at addressing that. Now, whether food loss and food waste, I mean, it does have an impact on the environment, but I mean, in terms of carbon footprint, it does reduce that, but it's not like a tangible thing that you can figure out and you can say, oh, okay, if you didn't have a loss, how much did you save? You can do the math, but then there's no program that does that.
Yeah, I need to, if I remember rightly, basically there's a whole world of working with this group, what are they called? Vera, who basically you go through, you can come up with protocol that they agree to as a way of verifying whether this counts as a kind of a carbon saving. And once you've gone through that whole process and agreed a standard, then I think then they'll let you start selling it. But it is quite a long-winded thorough process. You have to be operating at a certain scale to make that work well. But they do have a bunch that are already in there. So it's almost whether, like if you can find the one that's the right match for what you're doing, that it's something that suddenly becomes possible.
Sure.
But yeah. See, it does seem like it's hard to do. Do you know the folks Cold Hubs in Nigeria? They're kind of part of the network here. They seem like they're part of the solution, figuring things out.
Yeah, they're doing good. I mean, that's a good solution. I mean, there's a technology called ColdBot.
Okay.
And that's a US-based company, and they essentially convert a home refrigerator into a cooling chamber.
Okay.
And that's an easy way of doing it. I mean, that's like fooling the system. I mean, my background is refrigeration also. So that's an interesting way of doing that. And that could help people create a cold chamber for their produce to offset it.
Okay.
And they've had some success too. I mean,
Right.
For me, it's a little difficult for me to get on the carbon footprint perspective or environmental, because I'm still stuck on the food loss and food waste, because I think that has not been resolved yet. Yeah, well, but it's a huge part of the puzzle. I mean, I need to look at the numbers, but it's something like, if we're looking at the gains within the food sector, which is a 30% contributor, but could be a 30% carbon sink instead of a carbon source. Yeah. Food is a big slice of that. It is something like 20%. If we can sort out food waste and food loss, that is a huge part of that transition, with massive benefits for food security and quality nutrition. There's a whole bunch of other things that come along with it. So there's a win-win. Yeah, I mean, just look at it, when you look at it, just single tomato, right? A single tomato, it takes 6 gallons of water to produce. So, I mean, think about it. I mean, the amount of losses that are, and the amount of water that's been lost. Now, how does it equate to carbon footprint? I don't know, but that's the water footprint that you can see, that amount of losses that can impact on the water. Yeah. It does make me think, the power of, if we could access the funding that's going to only increase over the next decades for people to pay for turning around climate change. If that money can start coming into our sector, then it becomes an extra revenue stream for people that are providing the solutions. That is, the incentives in the whole system have to
change. Claire, you earlier, I think we're talking about large scale agriculture in America, but the whole thing was geared up in the 1950s to produce massive amounts of food because people had watched, the huge food insecurity and the conflict that's driven by that. And, the system, it kind of worked, but now it's a lock-in with subsidies that basically incentivize people just to mass produce a limited set of commodities. And until those subsidies change, we've got a system that keeps the same incentives driving it, and it will carry on in some form that's basically drawing down on nature. But if we can turn that around and start shifting those subsidies to being more to incentivize the kind of restoration of natural capital that we need for the food system, then that can change. And I think it's just a matter of time how quickly it happens. And for small businesses, it's a question about whether small businesses are able to access that, because it's so complicated that the transaction costs are, often exclude small businesses from benefiting from those markets that are emerging. And I do wonder whether that's, one of the things that we're about to be able to do we're going to do on the Good Food Hub is having some conversations with the coalitions that came out of the UN Food Systems Summit. And some of those are about regen ag and agroecology and those kind of spaces. And actually, I think, part of my aspiration for the hub is that we start to be able to turn up as small businesses and say, hey, we do want this change, but it's got to work for small businesses. And can we turn up in those spaces and say, hey, fantastic that we're beginning to get some funding coming through, some, changing of subsidies that are coming to change the incentives, but you have to make it work in a way that allows smaller businesses to access those, because we're ready to innovate. We can do this. You've got the solutions, but maybe you just need to tip it in favor so you're getting enough revenue that it means you can lean into them and grow them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that I had, this is a specific example. 6 months back, we had an issue. We were working with a client in India, and then they came up with a directive that we're going to ban all plastic bags. No plastic bags are going to be used in the retail sector. So then they said, are you willing to pay the cost? Because if you go with biodegradable packaging, it's going to cost you money. No. You're not going to pay for the biodegradable packaging, but you are going to ban the plastic bags. And so that the client said, what do I do? I mean, a lot of these clients close shop. They said, we can't do it. And then they changed the directive that they came out of, okay, you can do it in modification. I mean, it's the challenge is that the upper echelon people need to understand that if they come up with a directive, they need to come up with a solution also, not just say, oh, we're going to ban it. Okay, if you ban it, then what? What are the implications? And that's what the challenge for small business owners is, that, yeah, we are very cognizant of those carbon footprints and the environmental impact, but you need to have a solution both ways. And I think, Claire, that's what happened in Kenya too, right? The Kenya, some of the people I talked to in Nairobi, they had mentioned that there is a ban on single-use plastic.
Yeah, we had just ordered 20,000 bags to inoculum in, and then we couldn't get them in the country.
Whoops.
There's a trick to that, Claire. I think if we are able to reuse them, then they allow it.
Yeah, we switched over to buckets.
Okay.
We still have all these bags, so we're producing our primary inoculum in them, but the buckets hopefully are a good solution. And I haven't found a biodegradable mushroom spawn bag. So
that's very specific.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the whole measurement thing is tricky. Shubham was talking about it, like, how do you, if there's a farm that's treating 1,000 acres with a chemical herbicide or pesticide, you can track what the impact is of that herbicide or pesticide. And then if you're replacing that with something that's has a smaller footprint, because it's not mined in any component, doesn't have to get shipped around the world. and it's not causing, and doesn't have toxic features. So if you can measure what it would be to go from the bad thing to a good thing. But what if, for our sake, we're working with farmers who aren't using a chemical right now? So what do we measure? We can measure that our product's footprint is small because it's produced locally. We can measure that it's not toxic. We can measure that the farmer is then improving their yield on their acre, which is significant because some farmers have to desert their land and farm somewhere else if they have striga weed. So, but how do we measure that? And then how are we accountable for that? That's a tricky thing. Right now, a lot of the grants that we see are now including climate, which is great because we're a good climate solution. But I'm not sure how I can say, oh, this is our impact. We can more easily probably measure the impact we have on women's empowerment than we can on the climate or greenhouse gas reduction or whatever.
It's a real puzzle. I've heard the similar critique of the soil carbon piece, is that basically we're paying people to, if we it'd be great to be able to pay people to restore soil carbon, but you're paying people for the land that has been degraded. The people who have been maintaining their land and treating it really well for years and years and are continuing to have good practices, often traditional, have already got, they kind of maxed, they've got as much soil carbon in the soil as you're going to get. So they can't benefit from that, which seems a weird topsy-turvy. You're almost incentivizing people to degrade the land so you can then get the money to build it back up again. So it is really messy when you start unpacking the detail of these incentives that come from a really good place, but actually how you do it is messy. There is actually next week, as part of COP26, the International Chamber of Commerce is holding. They've got a series of over 2 weeks of COP. They've got a series of meetings for the business community, and one of them is on helping small businesses measure and report on their kind of positive outcomes, their impact reporting. When I write up the notes, I'll put the link to that in there. I'm not sure. It looks, to be quite frank, it looks quite high level, and you might fall asleep, but it might. Who knows? I think it's a chance, on the stage to kind of have some of those interests heard. It's run by Sage, who do all the accounting software. So, I think they presumably are looking to whether they can branch out into some tools for people. Have you come across the coolfarmtool.org? Because they're they're a British outfit that are really trying to help farms, at farm level, be realistic about how they measure and report their all their outcomes. Sort of how, to quite in a holistic way, to do that. And I haven't got under the skin of it, but I have heard it multiple times. People say they're at the front edge of coming up with a tool for that kind of holistic MRV for farm level activities in a way that works for farmers. So
I'll check that out.
Coolfarmtool.org.
There's a lot of talk as well about true cost accounting, which I think ties so directly into this about when we're looking at policy and moving money around.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter if somebody is going from a bad producer to a good producer, it should still benefit all the good producers. It shouldn't be about the transition. It doesn't seem like it would have to be about the transition. It would have to be about the output, but.
They're one of the other coalitions that came out of the summit. There is a true cost accounting, the true cost of food coalition. And so we may be able to kind of have a conversation with that group see if we can convene some SMEs to talk to them about what their plans are and whether they're remembering small businesses and making sure that whatever system starts coming out of that work, which will take a decade or so, I think, it's really is really complicated, but it does seem like the most holistic way of getting some of these incentives right.
There is a group called True Cost Accounting Accelerator, and it's on the East Coast Bayou, and the director of it was part of the Food System Game Changer Lab. They had one of the cohorts was on True Cost Accounting.
Oh, great.
So I met with them and a couple of their people who were in Asia working through restaurant systems on True Cost Accounting as well. Yeah, and then there's an organization called TIFS, TIFS, which is Transition in Investment. I forget what it all stands for, but it's about transitioning investments to regenerative agriculture and food systems. So maybe it's transition investments in food systems, something like that. But they are also trying to develop a tool for true cost accounting.
Hmm.
So there are all these things that, and I feel like the UN Food Summit hopefully helped spur this on, and hopefully things move a little bit faster and more efficiently than the environmental talks that have been going on for decades.
We'll see. I just feel like they've set up a lot of interest that feels a bit more like lighting, a million flowers, sort of like a million flowers bloom, and like generating lots of energy from people that are committed to doing something now, and we'll see what that creates, rather than a top-down hierarchical approach. The USFRA are interested, the US Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. They're taking a really strong stance that actually the way to change the incentives is around impact investment. So basically reducing the cost of capital for businesses that have a strong narrative around the positive impact that they're having, in a way that they looked at the amount of investment coming into the energy sector to kind of through impact investors. So all the stuff into renewables, and going, actually, because people started moving the direction, were willing to, because they were looking for the impact, the kind of the environmental impact return, and were therefore, the kind of cost of capital got lowered there, as people gave equity and debt into the sector. If we can have a similar movement in the food and ag sector, where people realize that food and ag has to change and it has a really positive impact if we get it right, then that's a nice way of kind of getting some financial incentives coming into companies like yours, to be able to, kind of get your financial return on you having a positive impact. And then it sort of softens the demand of proof. You're kind of getting the money early on because people can see, they believe in your idea. I think rather than almost the payment for services is really hard when you've got a narrative like yours, which is to substitute, to prevent adoption of bad practices. The right impact investor would see that. I don't know, but that's a push they've got to try and expand impact investment into the food and ag sector, which I think is an interesting one. They're a great organization.
I'll check them out.
All right. Well, I love talking to folks on the front line of making these things happen. But perhaps it's time to wrap up. And it's really inspiring always to hear the kind of both the passionate and the realism of making these change happen. It's going to be people like you that do that work. So thank you. And next Huddle is going to be in a few weeks' time. It's going to be about raising capital, which I guess ties nicely to the end of this conversation. We've got Clementine, I'm going to mispronounce her last name, but Cambon from Orgia Solutions, which is they've got a solution working with farmers for a pay-for-use. I'm going to forget exactly the sort of support services for farmers, but they've just got $1 million of investment. I think it's impact investment, and she's going to talk a bit about their journey to getting that money and see what other people are doing in terms of raising capital. And so that will be the topic of the next call, hopefully.